Thank you everyone for showing up today, and I would like to thank the Mohamed Ali Foundation for inviting me to speak today and hopefully to produce a paper out of this talk. I would like to thank Graham Harris for facilitating my arrival here. And of course, Professor Ehtishami for also inviting me here. This talk is based on a chapter in my dissertation. So my dissertation was on it's sort of a history of the Egyptian state's reform of Islamic endowments or Waqf in Egypt in like the 19th and like early 20th century. So this is like a story of political economy, of like, how capitalism forms in Egypt, of sovereignty. And so, this talk is based on the chapter that deals with the endowments of the khedive Abbas Hilmi II in Greece, in this island called Thasos. But in this talk, I'll sort of expand my focus to encompass this network of estates that Abbas Hilmi ran in the Aegean. So you can't really see from the projector, but so you see there is a little. So you see, my work in my dissertation focused on this island, Thasos, where Mohamed Ali, the founder of the Khedive dynasty, he founded like this major waqf or endowment in Thasos. But I'll sort of look at the connections between Thasos and these other estates that were acquired by Abbas Hilmi II in like the 1910s. So there's an Egyptic here in Rumelia. And on the Anatolian side of the Aegean, there's Haji Ali Bey and Dalaman. So these all share in common this ecology, this ecological balance between, and I would say like a delicate ecological balance between forestry and nomadism. And they're all facing the sea, and so in that sense, I think Abbas Hilmi II was able to consolidate his hold over these estates through building this elaborate infrastructure, like this naval infrastructure, technical infrastructure, but also political finesse, I would say, in sort of negotiating agreements with local communities. What I'm trying to do here is, conduct a bottom-up history of how local disputes between Abbas Hilmi II and these communities sort of impact the status of these estates under international law. So in a way, it's sort of a bottom-up history of like certain concepts in international law. So I sort of analyze these local disputes in terms of like this clash or conflict between mechanized agriculture, wage labor on the one hand, and sort of these local communal ways of managing the environment. And I argue like these conflicts were very constructive, were formative of these broader understandings of how these estates exist under international law. So this is also a story of like a transnational and trans-imperial history of how concepts of Egypt migrate to this part of the world in the Aegean. So like one concept I look at is public utility or manafa' umumiyya. There are different variations of like this concept. There's the khedival variation, from the time of Muhammad Ali all the way to Ismail, his grandson. And then there's like a sort of colonial iteration of that concept. So the khedival iteration of public utility, it's sort of multifaceted. It's based on, so let me sort of backtrack. So public utility, it's based on utilitarianism in European political economy. It rests on this idea of maximizing happiness numerically and collectively. So like it's almost like the greatest good in terms of like the number of like material interests, but there's also like an effective and religious aspect to it when it comes to Egypt. So the khedival concept of public utility, it while it emphasizes the material interests of Egyptians, it also pays attention to their spiritual well-being or their communal well-being. But under colonialism, when like the British colonized Egypt after 1882, this concept sort of goes through this change whereby it really emphasizes the material aspects of public utility. The idea of, and like Aaron Jakes in his book on Egypt's occupation talks about this, about how public utility emphasizes or it depoliticizes the peasants, Egyptian peasants, by sort of casting them as these profit-driven subjects who have no political pretensions. So I'm saying this because I'm trying to see, like in my paper, trying to like analyze how these concepts migrate to the Aegean and how like local communities sort of react to these and like readapt these concepts to suit their own local needs. So let me start, with a sort of a prehistory of the endowment in Thasos. So first of all, an Islamic endowment is to create an Islamic endowment. You usually have to draw a charter or a deed, and you sort of outline how the assets of a property are spent or used for charitable means. So I mean, there are two types of endowments. There's the ahli or family endowment, where you would designate beneficiaries from your family, and often this is like a means to circumvent Islamic inheritance laws, like sort of designate certain heirs to occupy the majority shares of an endowment. And then there's like a public endowment, the khayri waqf, where you sort of bypass like the family and dedicate the entire endowment to charitable causes, like it could be a soup kitchen or aqueducts, you name it, like many public functions. So in Thasos, Muhammad Ali creates a public endowment. And so the public endowment, it targets both the needy, like the poor, the needy, and students of Kabbalah. So this is like a major city opposite opposite Thasos. And so it was interesting here is that Thasos, it's only listed in the endowment deed as the provider or as the sort of the income source for this endowment. They in the deed they're not listed as beneficiaries. But what's interesting when you look at the documents in the Abbas Hilmi collection, you see how they're like making all these claims about being beneficiaries. So I mean, this is like a very interesting case of um, like a social history of an endowment, and I think there are not many studies that do that, looking beyond the legal documents like the deeds and looking at actually at how the people on the ground adapt or like make use of an endowment. So the endowment in Thasos is also interesting because it's in terms of like its legal status, it's very ambivalent. So originally, the Thasos was a tax farm. So a tax farm is this mechanism through which a tax farmer agrees to pay all the taxes to the Ottoman state in advance in return for keeping the remainder of like the income with him. So like Thasos was like a tax farm, but in 1813, Sultan Mahmud II, he turns this tax farm into a private property, and then ultimately he sort of endows it as a waqf for Muhammad Ali. So I mean, this is going to be the source of major friction between the Ottomans, the Egyptians, and the British. The British once they colonized Egypt, concerning like the legal status of like this island or this waqf. So like in my paper, and this is based on like my chapter in my dissertation, I sort of look at the prehistory of this endowment. Um, so I look at the role of Muhammad Ali's deputy in Istanbul, the Qadi Qatullah, as this sort of power broker. He's responsible for providing networks of credit for the endowment to work. He's sort of like pitting these different local intermediaries against each other in order to extract the greatest amount of resources from the endowment. He's also negotiating with local communities, like local villages and like their leaders. So, I mean, in the early 19th century, like these networks I'm talking about, I mean, they're horizontal in the sense that, so the Kapikat Uda was in touch with all like these imperial power brokers. So, for example, these imperial power brokers who are all the way to Istanbul, the imperial capital. So you have, these imperial dignitaries like, the Dowager Queen or the head of the black slaves in the imperial household, or like the admiral of the Ottoman Navy. So these are all people who have shares in the endowment, and like they're using the endowment slash tax farm, to, siphon resources to different like imperial functions. So like this horizontal system kind of changes under the Tanzimat reforms. This is like in the late 19th century when the Ottoman state reorganizes its bureaucracy, organizes the state itself in reaction to encroachment from European powers. So I mean, these reforms are centered on creating like a vertical hierarchy through like municipalities, and like aspects of like this process include assigning fixed salaries to the staff of the endowment instead of like these irregular commissions that the tax farmers used to take. Critically includes the rationalization of forestry. So like the endowment here under the Tanzimat, it hires like a group of professionals who supervise the villagers as far as like utilizing the forest resources of the island. Also includes like these reforms also include like a new police system, new like court investigations to expedite litigation of court cases, and like that's a replacement to like this very decentralized legal system on the island that included like Greek ecclesiastical courts, Sharia courts, these ad hoc councils that are created by the Waqf. This is like a vertical system. And like throughout the 19th century, this Waqf in Thasos was geared towards providing timber for Egypt. So, usually for like state building projects like telegraph, the Navy, among others. But, in the late 19th century, there's a shift towards meeting global demands for timber. And that sort of elicits a major ecological crisis on the island. So with an increase in smuggling, to meet global demand for timber, you have like a accelerating pace in deforestation, landslides, and drought. And like it's around that time that Khedive Abbas Hilmi II in 1896 it's around this time in 1896 that Abbas Hilmi creates this company, the Société de l'Île de Thasos, as like a limited company. And this is like an Egyptian invention. This is interesting how the khedive exports this corporate model to the Aegean. And like my paper sort of looks at how this model adapts to like local conditions. So I mean, this model, like this company model, it's based on transforming the local villagers into a proletariat, like a wage force. And the idea, and this is under this concept of public utility, the idea is that sure, like you're going to sacrifice the communal well-being of the villagers, you're going to alienate them from their forests, from their environments, but in return, you're going to like secure a surplus of cash that would allow the Waqf to invest in infrastructural projects, like a tram line, like better schools, public health infrastructure. And the villagers, they don't really take too kindly to that. I mean, they're really holding on, they're really attached to their forests. The forest is a source of not just timber, but also honey, wax, tar, firewood. And like they're jealously guarding their autonomy and their attachment to the forest, and they reject their proletarianization. So here, like, and this is like a map of Tassos from the archive from the Abbas Hilmi papers. You don't. Let's see if I can remove that. Sorry. Anyway, you don't really see it here, but the capital of the Waqf this year, it's the village of Limanos. And you see, like, most of the villages are sort of in the mountainous hinterland, but they all have ports. And these are like, major smuggling points, for timber. So, the endowment is trying to like centralize authority on the island, but it's failing spectacularly at that, because the villagers are smuggling timber. They're holding on to the forest in any way possible. And a lot of them, they escape, their proletarianization by, working in the tobacco warehouses of Kavala. And like, this is a region where there's a long tradition of migration. So in the 19th century, piracy was like an endemic problem in the region. Villagers would often escape, taxation by engaging in piracy, or, engaging in piracy to actually pay those taxes. And like, so like the new form of like this migration is, moving to like the tobacco, like work, like seasonal labor in the tobacco warehouses of Kavala. So like the tension between like the villagers and Abbas Hilmi II, they culminate in this major incident in 1902, where the Waqf administration sends its police force to quell a major protest. And it results in this, altercation whereby a few villagers, like around 7 villagers, are murdered, like shot in cold blood, and like they rebel. They petition the Ottoman Sultan, and they kick out the administration, the Waqf administration, from the island. And Abbas Hilmi, he reacts by using military force. He sends a sort of expedition from Egypt to quell the rebellion. But it's interesting how he sort of learns from his mistakes. He no longer emphasizes applying like turning the villagers into a wage force and respecting their communal privileges. And after 1902, the Ottomans, they invade the island. So I mean, there's this long-standing tension between the Ottomans and Egyptians about the status of this island. And so you have Sultan Abdul Hamid II, this very ambitious ruler who's trying to reassert imperial authority over the island. And he's exciting this long-standing dispute about, whether the island is a waqf or whether it's state land belonging to the Ottomans. So, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, he contracts with this German official, Heinrich Spiedel, and they formed together. They formed the Spiedel Mining Company to prospect, I think, mostly zinc, in the mines of Thasos in the interior. And it's interesting because the Sultan promises the villagers of Thasos that he's not going to employ them as a wage force. In fact, he's going to import villagers from like the Greek mainland to work these mines. And the idea is that he's, in that way he's going to spare the villagers any arduous labor. But what happens actually is that these mines, they actually contribute to the deforestation of Thasos. So it's the same problem all over again. So the second part of my paper, it looks at how Abbas Hilmi II reacts to this major debacle in Thasos. So after 1902, he acquires these string of estates in the other side of the Aegean, in Anatolia. So here's an image from the collection about, depicting his yacht, the Mahrusa yacht. And this is not just a luxury boat. This is a major piece of infrastructure that transports migrants, laborers, soldiers, officials between all these estates. And here you see like the port of one of the estates I'm talking about in Dalaman. So what's interesting is that, when you look at all like these locations, I mean, they're all places with like, very ambiguous, like a very ambiguous legal status. The same problem all over again, like whether they are endowments or whether they're state land or whether they're private estates. And that makes me wonder, like, why is the khedive picking these locations, right? And my argument, my preliminary argument that this is not a simple case of capital accumulation. This is not simply driven by profit, but this is a political project. And in that sense, the khedive, he's a political entrepreneur who's trying to establish these patron-client relationships with local communities as a way of building up his status and like occupying this niche between like the British and the Ottomans. So also in these estates, you see like this tension between like Sultan Abdul Hamid II and the khedive. This competition between, and well, you mentioned the khedive's private estates, the Daira Khassa, is competing with Abdul Hamid II's own version of like these estates, the Hazina-i Hassa. And I think like the Sultan, while he's in the Ottoman documents, they show how like the Sultan and Ottomans are apprehensive of Egyptian presence in this area. But at the same time, I think they're utilizing Egyptian expertise to settle and exploit these areas. These are like sparsely populated areas. They have a mixed population of African Maroon communities from Izmir, nomadic tribes, a lot of refugees arriving from the Balkans. And so I think the Sultan is relying on Abbas Hilmi II to resettle those areas. But also perhaps because these are like areas facing the sea, he's trying to protect these areas from a possible Russian or British naval invasion. So, I mean, in the records I've seen so far the past few weeks, it's interesting how, the inner circle of the khedive, they're asking themselves, why did we acquire these estates? We don't know their status. And this is part of my argument that, this is not a simple case of, of maximizing profit. This is a political project of trying to establish these close connections to local communities as a way of shoring up the khedive's status and legitimacy as a political entrepreneur. So, like, I end my talk in the paper with the loss of Thasos, and many of these, well, mostly Thasos, as a result of the Balkan War. So the island is occupied by first the Bulgarians and then the Greeks. And under the population transfer, a lot of Muslim Turkish-speaking refugees are sent to these Anatolian states. And this is, it's at that moment that the khedive is negotiating with the Ottomans on how to preserve his hold over these estates. And so something I came across in the Ottoman archives is this argument that these estates, they constitute a moral person. And this is like a question I like to share with you and with Will about what is a moral person? Like, what is the status of a moral person under international private and public law? Because I think this question answers the point about, how did the khedive hold on to these estates for so long? And, my preliminary argument is that, he capitalized on the ambiguity of the status of these estates precisely in order to prolong his hold over them and to build a niche for himself between the British and the Ottomans. So yeah, ultimately, I mean, this is, a project about how, first of all, it's a bottom-up history of local disputes and how they impact international law, but also it's a trans-imperial history of how, these events going on in Aegean are refracted back to Egypt. So this is like a question that intrigues me a lot, is how everything that I've said so far, how does it change how our like understanding of sovereignty in Egypt? Because often, I think transnational histories of Egypt, they often confine themselves to the borders of Egypt. So I'm trying to do here is do a history of Egypt by looking at its Aegean borders. So with that, I end my talk, and thank you.